Welcome to Ask With Logic, the video series where we're answering your questions. I'm Todd Smith and I'll be your host. Throughout this video series, we're going to cover things that we're experts in. So SEO, web design, web development, PPC, social media, photography, and videography. That's why we wanted to start Ask With Logic, to help serve out content to people who aren't just our clients. Because the more you guys know, the better decisions you can make. Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Ask With Logic. I'm joined by Aaron Cochran, who's our lead developer, and today we're going to be talking about just general website development. Aaron, do you want to tell us a little about yourselves and your background?
Yeah, so my background is actually in music. That's kind of how I got started in web development.
Yeah, that's a pretty direct correlation for me. When I think music, I think coder.
Yeah, you'd be surprised, though, the number of developers that are also musicians.
Why do you think that is?
They're both creative outlets. A lot of people think that development and programming is not creative, but it very much is. It's problem solving, and there's a lot of personal, just kind of ideas and flavors that you put into your code, similar to how you would make music.
That is a really interesting comparison. Like I've never even thought about.
Yeah.
For you, like, because obviously I know for like how we operate internally, a lot of times you're given like a design that has like pretty set instructions, for lack of a better word. Obviously, like there's still wiggle room. Do you ever wish there were less instructions or like restraints on that, and it was just like, hey, here you go? Or do you like when it's more like meticulously like thought out, like this and this and this? And do you think like your personal preference on that is like similar to most developers?
I can't really say that because it's probably unique. I personally like to have a lot of freedom. I mean, I think rules are great, but I think part of the fun of development is like when you don't have the rule and solving the problem. When you don't have something defined for you, your job as a developer is to make the language and the program define it and make it into a rule. So I think that's just kind of part of development. I'm totally just like blanking right now.
Dude, it's all good, man. Was there ever like, so I know like you said you did music, and I know like just from like our relationship like through work, like you worked at Pizza as a manager for a while. Mm-hmm. Like what got you into development and made you think like, yeah, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, my band. As you'll find a lot of developers probably from the mid 2000s when they were starting were in bands, and all those bands needed MySpace pages. So I actually started building websites by building MySpace pages. I just copy and paste code. I didn't know what it was. Had no idea what it did, but I knew that if I copied and pasted it and put it into one of MySpace's little boxes, it would make it look differently. And eventually I was like, well, maybe I should figure out what the heck this is actually doing behind the scenes and what all this means. And so I did that.
Dude, that's crazy. I've never heard that story. Do you think, did you guys ever get business from your MySpace page?
Yeah. I mean, like as a band?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were a touring band. We toured over the Midwest and had a booking agent and a manager and all those things. Did I get business as a web developer from that?
No. I mean, did you, I guess, like, were people reaching out to you guys either through or because of your MySpace page that you helped create? Like, was that like a big path of?
That was a lot of, every band's big path to the music industry was MySpace back in the early 2000s.
Dude, that's wild. MySpace, for those of you who do not know, is kind of like Facebook before Facebook was Facebook, but after Friendster.
And what's crazy to me is that there's people that are watching this that might actually not know what MySpace is.
Yeah, I was being kind of facetious at first, but the more I was speaking, I realized that, no, that's exactly
we
right.
might have people at our company that don't even know what MySpace is.
But TikTok's exploding right now, so sometimes you just got to roll with it. Cool. Well, now we have your background. Like a lot of today, we're going to be talking about like just general web development stuff. Yeah. In past podcasts and video series, we've talked about like web design and how it's different. So we've kind of covered how by the time a project gets to you guys, it's a lot more kind of bringing it to life.
Yeah.
The code wizards, the magic makers, bringing in like the animations and the hovers and the integrations and like really creating what most people see by the time it gets to the web.
Yeah.
What is like your favorite part of that process?
Basically what you said, bringing it to life. The instantly gratifying thing about web development, outside of other types of development, such as software development or like native app phone development. The wonderful thing, especially about front-end web development, is that you get instant gratification and instant response from the browser when you change something. So you write some CSS to make something red, and as soon as you refresh your browser, you instantly see that thing turn red. with other programming languages, you have to compile it and do all these things to make it run and work. And while there is some of that in the web world, it's not as common. And with web, you just get what you write, you get this instant response, and it's very satisfying. And once you have a good design, luckily we have good designers at our company, so it makes it nice. You just get to build cool stuff, and it's really satisfying once you're done building something, or such as some animation, and you interact with it and it looks and functions smoothly, and it's just really satisfying.
That's one of like my Todd nerd moments every single time. Like, don't write code. I have written one line of code actually for the Nelson Atkins. Shout out.
He wrote a div once.
I did write a div. I can also write classes. Not a big deal.
He doesn't know what a class is.
I write spans. Yeah, that's right. I know some words. But I remember like every single time like you're in the back end of WordPress and like you hit update and like how instantaneous it is, like still just like boggles my mind. I know it shouldn't at this point because it's been like years, but I literally like will change everything in the back end of a site and I'll hit update and all of a sudden it's just completely different. And like how instant it is, like it's just really, really cool.
Yeah.
So I can imagine like on your side, like when you're actually creating all that framework and all that, seeing that come together in a whole different kind of way, it has to be like really like satisfying.
Yeah. And it's satisfying in different ways for different types of developers. So I spoke about being if you're a front end developer and having that instant satisfaction of seeing it visually on the page and interacting with it visually on the page, that's a lot different from like a back end developer. Their satisfaction is going to come from making things run fast and communicate back and forth between servers and browsers and make it to where you can upload data somewhere and get that data and display it on a page. So there's lots of different levels of satisfaction and different types of satisfaction depending on the type of developer you are.
And you kind of touched on like the difference between like front end and back end. Do most people identify as one or the other?
It depends. There's certainly preferences, and I think a lot of developers have a preference, but there are some developers that consider themselves full stack developers. That would be someone that does both. They're comfortable working in the front-end languages, which are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they're comfortable working in back-end languages like PHP or Ruby.
Mm-hmm. And would you consider yourself full stack at this point?
Yeah.
But you started out as front-end.
I did.
And Lifted Logic basically forced the evolution of Aaron to a full-stack developer.
Basically. But it's just, it's nice, though, because obviously you want to grow and learn, and
that's probably why you got in the first place.
Exactly. When you're doing the same thing over and over again, like you're not growing and learning. So getting put into new situations, working on new types of projects with different types of clients, just gives you an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I think that's really cool about working at Lifted Logic is between the designs and the clients, like it's never the same thing. Right. So like there might be like similarities that you take from one like build to the next, but like overall it's still going to be different. Earlier you kind of mentioned like the difference between like web development from app development and software development. Mm-hmm. You want to kind of walk us through kind of like the main pillars of each or how they're different, and like because like I think to like more people like me who have no real like web development background before working at Lifted Logic, I always thought the coding is coding. Right. So like how do I go about like knowing the difference between them, or like when I need each, if that makes sense?
I think where this is most relevant for most people today would be the difference between like a mobile app versus like web app or a website. The difference between the two is, for more or less, is one can be ran and installed on your phone. One is ran on your browser and can't be installed on your phone. Mm-hmm. Native applications and native software for Windows or Mac PCs are all built using native codes such as C++ or Swift for iOS and Java for Android phones. So when you build something natively, you're building it for that platform specifically.
Mm-hmm. And there's different like ways to write the code, different requirements usually.
Right.
And just all like it's just like a lot more custom to like that one very specific thing.
Yep. And kind of said it a little bit earlier, all that code has to be compiled into something that your computer or phone can understand. So it's just a very different process. And when you're working on the web, the languages don't have to do that. They all run in your browser, which is awesome. Obviously, we all use the internet basically every single day. And so for widespread use, if your goal is to just get your product and out there to as many people as possible, you usually are probably going to look at something web-based because so many people have access to the internet. When you start doing native specific things, you're depending on your costs, if you don't have a big budget, you're probably only targeting one piece of software or one device, such as, I'm just going to build an iOS app, or I'm just going to build an Android app.
Because you end up with like 2 separate code bases.
For the most part, yeah. That changes every day, and there are things that help mitigate some of that. But for the most part, you're building a Android app, and you're building an iOS app, or you're building a Mac app, and so that's all these different sets of code bases that you have to maintain and manage, and obviously that's costly and can take a lot longer. Whereas when you build a website or a web app, you put it up in the browser, and anyone that has access to a browser can access and use your product.
And then how does software development differ even from those two?
Software development is basically native. That's kind of encompasses
a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. Web apps are still considered software. There's usually just more in a piece of software. There's more logic. Usually, there's more functions happening. You're usually going on and doing something. Whereas something like a basic website, it might just be like a landing page or a marketing page. It's not really doing anything.
I think that's like what we run into, because we do a majority like web development. But
right.
We also like do some app stuff and some software stuff. And I think the biggest gap is usually how much upkeep there is on software and apps, right? So like if it's done well, a website you can kind of like almost leave on from a code standpoint, and like you can rely on like the content management system, and you don't necessarily need someone constantly updating code.
Right.
But if you're running like your business like through an app or like or millions of users through software, like there's going to be bugs, there's going to be issues. Like you need someone who understands it, who can like regularly do maintenance on that.
Yeah. Well, and devices are always updating, right? There's a new iOS version every few months. There's new Android versions. There's new Mac versions. So every time that updates, you have to update your code to account for that. And the same is like it's the same case for browsers, but it's not as involved.
Is it less frequent?
It's actually probably more frequent. Browsers update all the time,
but smaller.
But
updates.
It's just because that the languages aren't compiled. So there's a lot more backwards compatibility. The web working group is pretty aware of breaking changes, so they try not to initiate and let through new changes that are going to break stuff. They update pretty frequently, but it's just not quite the same.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good like jumping off point, because obviously there's different browsers out there, right?
Yep.
So why do sites sometimes look different in Chrome versus Safari versus Firefox versus RIP, Internet Explorer, now Edge?
Yeah. So
like why can't they look the exact same?
Yeah. So browsers are a piece of native software. So browsers are going to be written in some native language for your device specifically. And then they all use different rendering methods. So back in the day, it used to actually be even more difficult to make a site look the same in Chrome and Internet Explorer or Safari, because every browser renders things differently. They have their own rules and their own ways of implementing certain CSS features, which CSS is the language that basically makes things look the way they look on the web. So they all have their own way of doing that and implementing it. There are rules and guidelines that they all typically follow, but it's not 100% across the board. So something that you do one way in Chrome might not even work in Internet Explorer, for instance.
Is that ever frustrating?
Oh yeah, it's crazy frustrating, and most developers wish Internet Explorer would go away.
I think not just developers.
Yeah.
Are there any tools you guys use in order to like test throughout the different browsers?
Yeah, there's software and different websites you can use, such as there's a product called Browser Stack. So basically what it does is emulates different browsers for you, so you can see how it looks and functions inside. Even if I'm working on my Mac, which doesn't run Internet Explorer, obviously I can still open up Browser Stack and open up an instance of Internet Explorer to see what it does in there.
How it works.
And it lets you do mobile devices as well. So I can test a tablet, an iPhone, Android, whatever. Different versions as well. I can go back to iOS 4 if I want.
Was there a time like back in the day, like even before, I guess when you first started before then, where like Browser Stack wasn't really a thing, so you were having to open it up and go through the site on every browser, or the main browsers and like mobile and tablets and all that stuff?
Yeah. A lot of those things, the web as a platform is relatively young still. So things are just growing and changing all the time at a very fast pace. So the technologies and tools that we have available to us today weren't around, and the methods that we use today to build websites are drastically different than what we used to do. Some people think it's easier today to get started because building things to cross-browser to work in Chrome, Internet Explorer, whatever browser is easier today than it used to be. But there's a lot more, from a development perspective, there's a lot more tooling that's involved to run our code. And,
what do you mean by tooling?
Yeah, so things to run our code, as basically things to make the developers happy. So when I'm writing code, there's different tools that we can use as developers to make our lives easier, to move faster, be more organized, be consistent if you're working in a team.
Do you feel like that sometimes is like for newer developers turns in like almost like a crutch?
Sometimes, yeah. You might learn one specific way of doing things versus learning a programming practice from the fundamentals.
Because like you're not like having to necessarily figure it out yourself. Like
right.
you'll be able to like rely on that tool.
Yeah. But it's also extremely helpful though. Obviously it allows us to move faster. It keeps us organized. It keeps us consistent across our team. Like it helps us enforce coding standards, which do matter.
Wait, that's important?
Yep.
Code standards?
Yeah.
Wait. So you're saying that writing good code matters?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you have bad code, it can have a trickling effect in a bunch of different ways. It could be some front-end bug that makes your site look completely broken. You could have images falling off the page. It could be a back-end bug, and that could make your site extremely slow. You could have, you have things like, obviously, we as a company use WordPress a lot, which lets you install plugins. So plugins let you basically just, maybe your site doesn't currently have a feature, you can install a plugin to add a new feature. That plugin could be built really poorly, and a really common issue with a lot of WordPress sites is they slow down drastically because they have too many plugins that aren't built very well. So when you have all that bad code running, it just kills your site.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about this like for years. You've always said that the number one standard of code is it works.
Yeah.
And the second one is it's clean, right?
Yeah. So requirement number one when it comes to code is it works. Requirement number two is it looks right.
Yeah.
So as a front-end developer, it doesn't matter if your code works if it doesn't look right. But it doesn't matter if it looks right if it doesn't work. And then the third one would be it's written well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And can you usually kind of tell those, all three of those things pretty quickly looking at another developer's code?
I mean, if the site's not working, it's going to be broken as soon as you go to the site, right? Yeah, you can. There's lots of different programming practices. Some of them are more subjective and opinionated than others, and some are just preference to whoever the lead developer might be on the team. But yeah, there's certain standards that you can tell pretty quickly if a developer's not following them. There's best practices that you can see pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense too. It just keeps it consistent throughout. I guess the question, just on the personal side, is and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. Why did you want to become a developer? I know how you got into it and stuff, but what was that aha moment when you're like, wow, this would be a really cool career?
Yeah, it was basically just while I was building MySpace pages, and as I started learning more about what the code actually was doing that I was copying and pasting, I just fell in love with it. It just captivated my attention. It was that was going on while I was in school, and I started spending way more time focusing on teaching myself web development than teaching myself music, which was what I was supposed to be doing in school.
Dude, yeah, we've been talking about this on other versions of Ask LL, and it's everyone here is self-taught, right? Yep. Which is a really cool team to be a part of, because everyone's hungry in that way to learn more and get better. In the tech space, you can't rest on your laurels, right? Whether it's PPC, because I was talking with Courtney earlier, a couple episodes ago, or Katie or you or Becca or whoever on the team, everyone's always hungry to learn more, and things change so quickly and rapidly. We internally we do a dev meeting every Aaron meets with the devs every day, but also one big dev meeting each month where the team brings different concepts and ideas and new ways to do things and all that, and they kind of hash out which ones are feasible and which ones aren't, but there's always ideas, right? Because it's always changing, always different ways to do things. And in my understanding of a lot of the development stuff, there's not necessarily a right way.
Yeah.
It's kind of like whatever, A, it works, B, it works for your team, and like it's a lot of gray area.
Yeah. So I have a lot of, like any developer is going to have a lot of personal preferences.
You guys are like an oddly opinionated group, I will say.
Yeah. Well, we have to be.
Yeah.
But it just depends on your working environment. You have a lot of lone developers who do just get to do things their own ways, and it doesn't matter. It has to work for them. Awesome. When you have to work with a team, and not just a team of other developers, but a full team of designers and content writers and people that help put content in, as well as building on a platform that allows clients to put content in, you have a lot more people to account for and a lot more people's jobs to build around. So there's a lot more technical constraints to that. So sometimes what your personal preference might be isn't going to be what's best for the team, because anything that I decide to change is probably going to affect the entire company in some way, shape, or form. We can change something with how we build out the backend of sites. And all of a sudden that changes what the content people are used to. It changes what the interaction and experience is going to be like for the client when they're updating their site. There's just a lot of individual jobs to account for other than just like personal developer preference.
And what you just kind of said, you mentioned like the backend of sites and clients and stuff. And I know for us at Lift Logic, that's a really big point, is to make sure that clients have the ability and the flexibility to like change words and content and all that stuff. And you'll hear the term like CMS thrown around quite a bit. What does that stand for, and what does that even mean? Yeah,
it's content management system. It's just a platform that gives you the ability to update content on your site, whether it's images, uploading PDF files, changing out paragraphs,
text,
writing a blog post, publishing a new page, anything you'd want to change.
And is WordPress a CMS?
Yes, it is a framework and is also a CMS.
Okay. What are other examples of CMSs out there?
Drupal, Shopify.
So basically, any like at high umbrella, any platform on the web that allows you to go and be able to make those kind of changes is a content management system.
Right.
Why does Lift Logic use, I wouldn't say like exclusively WordPress, because that's not true, but probably 70% of our builds are like taking the WordPress framework, stripping it down and building on top of it custom. Why do you think that's a good way to go?
Yeah, WordPress has been around for a really long time now. So it has a really, really well-built community. So there's a lot of knowledge that is easily accessible, which sometimes can be a burden when things start to grow that largely. Obviously, there's a lot more hands on it. There's a lot more people writing the core code for it. But for the most part, it's a really extensible platform. So we can basically morph it to whatever we need it to do. I think WordPress gets a really bad rap sometimes because it's been around for so long. So its code base can feel kind of dated at times, but it also gives us the flexibility to give clients the ability to build anything they want to build in a really cost-effective way.
Are there, because I think a lot of questions that we get is like, for the people who think there's a negative stigma around WordPress, it's usually based around security.
Yep.
Do you think those concerns are valid?
Yeah. So we kind of talked about plugins earlier. So the beauty and the curse of WordPress is because it's so flexible. If you have a WordPress site and you go on and you're not really monitoring what plugins you're installing and you're just picking anything and just installing it, and all of a sudden you've installed 100 plugins, just like we talked about earlier with performance, you don't know how well that was built. So the developer of that plugin could have not really built it in a very secure way. So it's not that WordPress itself is insecure. It's because it's so flexible and anyone can build a theme or a plugin. Those are where the security issues come into play, because you don't know what developers built those things.
Yeah, I will say that's like a nice thing for us internally is we have amazing guys like Aaron and Melissa and like just the entire dev team who can audit codes, right? Or audit plugins. So I can look at it and be like, hey, a client wants to do this. We don't have the time and the budget necessarily to build it custom. Does this plugin, like, work? Does it make sense? Is it okay? And Aaron's like, no, that's like, it's not built well. Like, we don't want to do that. Or like, no, that like, I know about this. It's fine. Like, I know the guy who wrote it or whatever it is. So it puts us kind of like in a nice position where we don't just like add plugins willy nilly. And that's kind of like always one of like the big things I tell clients, like you can add whatever you want to the site. It could negatively impact the site. It could affect like the speed of it. It could like affect the security of it. If it breaks the site, like obviously if we have to revert back and fix things. So there's always that risk. If you don't know who wrote what you're adding.
Yeah.
And I know like another like big platform that people talk about is Shopify. And like, obviously that's going to be pretty different than WordPress.
Yeah.
Cause it's going to focus more on like e-commerce stuff. Do you think like it's a good alternative for people who maybe can't afford a custom e-commerce build or how do you feel about Shopify?
Yeah, it's a great platform. I think they serve different purposes.
Yeah.
And as any CMS platform you're going to choose, it does. So obviously they have similarities, but ultimately they kind of do different things. So WordPress is an open source framework, which means you can host it yourself, but there is a hosted version. When you host WordPress yourself, it allows you to build it into whatever you want to build it into. That's what we do. It allows us to strip it down and build endless possibilities of types of platforms and websites we can build. Shopify is geared towards one thing, and that is getting a store up and running quickly. It is a hosted platform, so while you can edit it somewhat, you do not have the flexibility to edit it. So it depends on what types of features you're looking for. It depends on if you have any specific integrations for like POS systems, like, CRMs, anything like that.
Recurring subscriptions, or anything like that.
It just depends on what sort of features you need as to which one would be right for you.
I guess we talked about Shopify, we talked about WordPress as platforms. Is there any others, or like what's one more that maybe people haven't heard of that is like really good, really strong that you'd like recommend?
From a CMS or just platforms in general?
Either or.
So as a developer, a framework that I really advocate for and we use internally would be Laravel. It's a PHP framework, which lets us build any number of different types of web apps, websites, all sorts of things.
Software.
Yep. I think if you have a project and you need a custom built web app, Laravel is probably the way to go.
It's cool. I know a lot of people have asked me or need like help explain like the difference between like your web browser versus your web server. Is there a quick, easy way that you can help them understand what the difference is? Yeah.
So your browser is what you see. It's what you're interacting with when you open up Google Chrome. That's your web browser. The server is what is communicating with that. So basically, the server is a computer somewhere in a room, which is what we would call the cloud. There's a computer somewhere that is communicating to your device and your browser, telling it what content to have, what data to have.
I know a lot of people have asked us, like, and we've talked about this a little bit with the plugins and with just talking about code in general, is the topic of page load speed.
Yeah.
So how important is code to page load speed? How important is like just the question of page load speed in general? How do you know if your site is actually loading slow or if the Google test isn't that accurate? Like, how do you know like when you should be like concerned?
Yeah. So obviously speed and performance is extremely important. People have short attention spans, right? So they're not going to sit there and wait for your site to load forever when they could go to one of your competitors' sites and do it quicker. So it's extremely important. And code is important. Obviously, if you have bad code running on your website, it might not process correctly, which would make them not be able to get through like checkout, so to speak. It could be using inefficient functions to slow the site down. You could have bloated software, a bunch of plugins installed that's slowing everything down, making too many requests to your server to slow it down. Some of it is not code related. Some of it can be, especially working in a content management system, how big are the images that you uploaded? Yeah. How much content do you have on a single page? Basically, anything that you're adding to your site is going to slow it down over time eventually. So there's a lot of different aspects to it. As for how can you test that, and is like, I know Google obviously has what a lot of our clients use. They have their page speed tests, which it's very insightful. It's not always the end all be all of judging the speed of your site. It is extremely helpful. Obviously, Google is the authority of the internet. That
should be their new tagline. Google, the authority of the internet.
Yeah. which it is important, but it's not the end all be all. They do, especially working in a WordPress world, some of the way they measure certain things doesn't necessarily. They might be pushing. They'll measure stuff for new features that might not be available for all browsers. For instance, they'll dock you for using a certain image format that's actually only available on Google Chrome. So they're basically docking anyone that's not using Chrome. So while there are a lot of important metrics on there, it's not the end all be all.
We've kind of talked about different like languages and frameworks a little bit earlier, but I'd like to kind of like expand on that. You mentioned earlier the different front-end languages. Excuse me. What are your favorites? Like, and which ones are the most useful? Like, I guess if you were going to if someone was like, I want to learn code,
yeah,
I'm going to learn to code. What are like the first like one or two things that you're like, hey, you should start here?
Yeah, so it just kind of depends on where you're coming in at. Really big thing right now is React. It's a JavaScript framework. It's just all the rage right now. So if you're going to be looking into getting in the JavaScript world, you'd probably want to look at React. Obviously, we work with PHP, so we work with frameworks such as Laravel and WordPress. Basically, this allows us to work with a lot of different types of clients with a lot of different types of projects. WordPress hosts 30% of websites are hosted on WordPress. That's an astronomical number.
Yeah.
So obviously, like WordPress sites aren't running off React. So being PHP experts and WordPress experts gives us the ability to work on a large number of websites and build things in a way that is easy to understand for clients. I personally love WordPress. It gets a really bad reputation sometimes for like what you're talking about with security and stuff, but it's a very good platform and it's very flexible. I'm a big fan of Laravel as well. So if you're coming into the PHP world, Laravel is fantastic. It's very developer friendly. So get up and running really quickly for really large ideas and web apps. Jamstack right now is all the rage.
That just sounds cool.
Yeah,
sign me up. I want Jamstack.
It stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. So it went
from being cool to being super nerdy really quick.
Yeah, that's development. Right?
Yeah, that is.
Basically, you might hear buzzwords such as headless or serverless being thrown around, and that's basically where that comes from. Is the Jamstack. It's a little misleading because nothing is serverless. There's always a server somewhere communicating with your site. But basically, it's a decoupling of where your content comes from versus where you're displaying it. So when you're working on a WordPress site, for instance, your content's coming from WordPress and what you're seeing is coming from WordPress. With the Jamstack, your content might be coming from your content could be coming from WordPress, but what you're seeing on the front end is actually hosted completely somewhere different.
Interesting.
Yep. So there's that. They're not coupled together anymore, which is where the term headless would kind of come from. But
is there an advantage to that?
Yeah, it can be more performant because you're not quite loading things. So WordPress, whenever when you load a page in WordPress, there's a lot of things that WordPress runs to get you to the point of what you're seeing on the page. That's not all necessarily running if your front end is separated out. It's not making all the same calls. So it just kind of depends on how you built it. But there's lots of ways to get around that with WordPress, such as caching a page. So it's not making all those requests every single time you load the page. As well, there's a lot more services needed to run a serverless Jamstack site. For instance, just thinking about let's pretend you have your content on WordPress and your front end is hosted somewhere else. That means you now have to pay for your WordPress hosting. And then you have to pay for hosting to host your front end of the site. Lots of times, though, people don't use WordPress for it, so they might be using something else. So they might have a whole different service or API running for forms, a whole other one running for products. So it's really easy to be paying for a lot more individualized products and services to run your website. Whereas with something like WordPress, you kind of have it all right there. and it's just together and a little easier to maintain.
Yeah. Another like really common hot topic, I guess if you will, is like ADA compliance.
Yeah.
So we'll get into like the nitty gritty of ADA at a future episode.
Mm-hmm.
But just like at a high level, what is ADA compliance, and how do you know if a site should be ADA compliant?
Yeah. So in the web world, ADA compliance is just making sure that anyone with any sort of disability can come to your website and perform all of its essential functions.
Is it safe to say that most sites currently on the internet are not ADA compliant right now?
Probably so, yeah.
At the time, because like it has not been like really an enforceable law to this point.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a shift that will be coming over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah. Aaron has been an advocate for ADA compliance as long as I've known him. It's been fun to like listen to him and the designers kind of go back and forth on it, because some of the things that make a site ADA compliant make it less pretty. And so Aaron's been the champion.
In their opinion.
Yeah, in their opinion.
Don't tell them that.
But Aaron's been the champion for the ADA stuff.
Yeah.
So like we've done like a lot of stuff internally where just to make the sites closer to that just naturally with like how the code we write, how we insert images, all that kind of stuff. I guess, is there a quick way to test to see if your site is ADA compliant?
There's
I understand, like, okay, even taking a step back, there are a bunch of unofficial, official rules about ADA compliance currently.
Right.
And none of them are like officially law. What's the first thing you do if you're on a site, if you're wondering, is the site ADA compliant?
Yeah. So obviously you can test visual things. You can use testing software to test color contrast. Obviously you can just use your eyes. If you, as a normally sight-seeing person without any visual disabilities, if you're having trouble reading that super small text, then someone that has any issues seeing probably can't read that text. So you can use your eyes, obviously. It can be anything from just testing the interactions. So when you're scrolling on a page, does it behave normally? Does it behave how you would expect it to? Would someone that can't use a mouse, maybe they have to rely on their keyboard?
I was going to say, is tabbing over a really big one?
Yeah. So sometimes developers will make decisions that make it to where the normal tab functions of a website don't actually function, or they don't function correctly.
Why would they? Is there a reason, like, is it just laziness? Is it like not needed? Like, why would you just not do that?
It's usually just not being educated. They might make a decision to implement something in a specific way that has to maybe overwrite the tab key, or maybe they create something like a pop-up, and they don't think about once this pop-up opens, and if I'm someone using my keyboard to navigate a website and I press tab, what happens? They might not just think through it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily malicious intent or laziness on their part. It's usually just lack of education.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, we'll jump more into ADA compliance at a future episode. But like one thing that I always reiterate to clients is you can launch a site ADA compliant, but as soon as you like add a photo but you don't label it correctly, or like little things like that, the website technically stops ceasing to be ADA compliant, right?
Yeah.
So like that's just like a thing to be really educated about, and it's a whole other topic to get into. Is just how to keep on top of that, like for future like content updates, right? So that's like when we talk about giving clients content management access so they can do all that stuff. It's us educating them on things to keep in mind when they do that. Another really big thing that we talk about both internally and with clients is APIs.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people have maybe heard the term or the phrase, but probably don't know that much about.
Yeah. Buzzword.
Buzzword, man. Synergy, things like that. So even like I guess we'll probably do a future one about APIs like in depth as well. Like we'll really nerd out on it. But even just at a high level right now, like what does API stand for? How does it work? What does it do?
Yeah.
Like, so does everyone need an API?
Yeah. So it stands for Application Programming Interface. Basically what it is giving you access to data and functionality that might not live on your site already.
Like what's a good example of that?
Payment processors, so Stripe or Authorize.net, how they all have APIs that they expose so that we as developers can process credit cards through their services while still being PCI compliant, and they take care of a lot of the security for that, and a lot of that stuff. So those are really big ones. Any shipping services such as FedEx, UPS probably have APIs exposed to get shipping rates.
Pulling in like pricing information from
from POS systems. CRMs usually have APIs for you to submit new entries and new leads to their platforms.
Basically at a really high level, is it called endpoints? Like where you're basically mapping out through code where certain things from the API end up on the site or vice versa.
That's one way that's one word for it. There's lots of different API methods, and REST APIs with RESTful endpoints is one of them.
Nice.
Basically saying, I want to grab a new product, so you would have an endpoint to send your browser to go get a new product and bring that data back to your website.
And then I guess, what should a client be asking the company that has the API in order to know if like their website can integrate with it?
So it kind of just depends on what they're trying to accomplish. So two-way communication is important. If you're trying to not just get information from that API, but also send information back to update something such as in a CRM or post new orders to a POS, you need to not be able to just grab it. You need to be able to send it back and save it. So that's important. Request rates and limits are important. So how many times is this API allowed to be hit and used before it stops working, or I get charged more?
That's always a really big one.
That's really common with APIs, especially like Google API has rate limits. So any sort of Google map that's running off their API platform, once it's loaded too many times, will start costing you more money.
And like I know, like even just like taking a step back, the first step is usually if you're wanting to integrate your website with like your POS or your CRM or any of that kind of stuff, it's going to be, you need to ask that company if they have an open API and to send over the documentation. Right. So guys like Aaron, they need to know how to map all this stuff out. And we've worked with multiple clients who have been told that their company has an API or that they're going to have an API and they don't. And so at the end of the project, we're kind of stuck. And so we're trying to figure out ways like how can we write, if there's a sale on the website, but it can't go into your inventory system because your inventory system doesn't have an API, how do we get around that? So I cannot recommend, encourage you guys enough that before you start that kind of project, reaching out to that other company and asking for the API documentation.
Yeah, you have to know what their capabilities are before you can really move forward in any sort of project, because we can't promise things that aren't possible.
Yeah. Oh, but if we could.
Be dangerous.
Yeah, right? Cool. Last question I have for you is just, I know you were one of the longest tenured LiftLogic employees. You've been here almost 5.5, 6 years.
Yeah.
I know you've seen a lot of shit. What is your favorite project you've ever worked on?
I don't know that I have a singular favorite project, but I have a favorite type of project.
Okay.
I like two types of projects. I really take a lot of pride in building this websites for really well-known local things.
Like what?
Such as KC Ballet, Nelson Atkins. Those are two really big parts of the Kansas City community. So I think it's really cool when you're just out with friends or something, be like, oh yeah, I helped build the website for these really big KC staples. I think that's just really cool, and it just makes the job really rewarding at times. And then my other favorite type of project to work on would probably be, and this has kind of come about as I've grown in my role at LiftLogic, but internal tools and basically doing things to make the other developers on our team's lives easier. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's really cool. I can see the value in both those, right? I think being part of KC, if you've never been here, it's really just a big town of 2 million people, but it feels like it's 2 sometimes. And so it's a pretty, the amount of KC pride is insane. And so anytime you get to touch one of the big staples and the arts or any part of the community, it's really, really cool. And then anytime you can make your coworkers better and their lives easier, you're going to love that. Feel free to hashtag AskLL on social media and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. But keep in mind, there are no stupid questions, especially in the digital space.